People who like to be alone are often described with simple words: introverted, reserved, antisocial. But those words are lazy. They describe behavior, not the mind behind it. Because if you actually sit with someone who prefers solitude, not for 5 minutes, not in small talk, but in real silence, you start to notice something unsettling. They are not empty. They are not bored. They are not avoiding life. They are processing it. Most people experience life outwardly, through conversations, reactions, noise, and constant exchange. Their thoughts are shaped by what happens around them. When the world goes quiet, they feel uncomfortable, restless, exposed. But people who like to be alone live life inwardly first. Before they speak, they observe. Before they react, they analyze. Before they attach, they understand. And that difference alone separates them from the crowd. Psychology shows that solitude-seeking individuals don't lack social ability. They lack tolerance for unnecessary emotional noise. They are sensitive to inconsistency, surface level interaction, and forced connection. Their nervous system doesn't crave stimulation. It craves coherence. This is why crowds exhaust them faster than silence ever could. While others feel energized by attention, they feel drained by it. Not because attention is bad, but because attention often demands performance. Smiling at the right time, reacting correctly, explaining yourself repeatedly, playing roles you never chose. And here's the first uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. People who like being alone are not hiding from others. They are hiding from distortion. They learned, consciously or unconsciously, that too much interaction pulls them away from themselves. That when they spend too much time around people who don't listen, don't reflect, or don't understand depth, they start losing clarity. Their thoughts scatter, their emotions blur. So they retreat, not out of fear, out of self-preservation. This isn't antisocial behavior, it's psychological filtering. When someone enjoys solitude, their mind becomes a closed system. They recycle thoughts, they replay moments. They search for meaning. While others distract themselves from discomfort, they sit inside it until it dissolves. And that ability changes how they experience pain. Most people need others to regulate their emotions. When they're hurt, they need to talk. When they're confused, they need reassurance. When they're lonely, they seek company. But people who like being alone learned something early, sometimes too early. They learned how to self-regulate. Instead of panicking in emotional silence, they slow down. Instead of chasing distraction, they analyze. Instead of outsourcing comfort, they generate it internally. That's why solitude feels safe to them. It's predictable. It doesn't judge. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't misunderstand. And that safety rewires the brain. Neuroscience shows that people comfortable with solitude have stronger default mode network activity. This is the brain system responsible for introspection, self-reflection, memory integration, and meaning-making. In simple words, their mind doesn't shut down when nothing is happening. It turns on. Silence activates them. And that's terrifying to a world addicted to noise. Because a person who can sit alone without stimulation becomes hard to manipulate. They don't need constant validation. They don't panic when ignored. They don't fear boredom because boredom becomes insight. This is why people who enjoy being alone are often misunderstood as distant or emotionally unavailable. But the truth is the opposite. They feel deeply. They just feel privately. They don't broadcast emotions. They metabolize them. When they're hurt, they don't explode. They withdraw. When they're angry, they don't shout. They reassess. When they're disappointed, they don't beg. They detach. And detachment to the outside world looks cold. But inside, it's calculated. Because people who like being alone don't leave situations impulsively. They don't cut people off over one mistake. They endure longer than they should. They observe patterns quietly. They give chances without announcing them. And when they finally choose solitude over connection, it's never sudden for them. It's overdue. This is the psychology most people miss. Solitude seekers don't enjoy being alone because they hate people. They enjoy being alone because it's the only place where their mind isn't compromised. No emotional negotiation, no energy leakage, no self-betrayal, just clarity. And once someone experiences that level of internal stability, external chaos loses its appeal. Drama becomes loud, small talk becomes exhausting, forced bonding feels dishonest, so they choose the quieter option, not because it's easier, but because it's cleaner. And this is only the surface, because once you understand why they feel safer alone, you start to see something darker underneath. Something rooted not in personality but in experience. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. People who like to be alone didn't wake up one day and decide they preferred silence over people. This preference wasn't chosen. It was learned, and most of the time it was learned quietly. Not through dramatic trauma, not through obvious abuse, not through moments anyone else noticed, but through repetition. Small moments where emotional presence was missing. Small moments where being understood required too much explaining. Small moments where opening up led to confusion, dismissal, or indifference. Over time, the brain starts connecting patterns. When I speak, I'm misunderstood. When I explain, nothing changes. When I feel deeply, it becomes inconvenient. So the mind adapts. Psychology calls this emotional conditioning, but that phrase doesn't capture how personal it feels. Because what's really happening is this. The nervous system learns that connection carries a cost, and the cost is emotional friction. People who enjoy being alone often grew up learning that emotional expression didn't guarantee safety. Sometimes it led to conflict. Sometimes it led to silence. Sometimes it led to being labeled as too much or too sensitive. So instead of expressing more, they learned to compress. They learned to keep thoughts inside. They learned to feel without showing. They learned to process privately. And eventually, something important happened. Solitude stopped feeling empty. It started feeling familiar. This is why being alone doesn't scare them the way it scares others, because emotional solitude was already part of their emotional landscape long before adulthood. They didn't suddenly become isolated. They simply recognized a state they already knew how to survive in. And here's the part people get wrong. They didn't become emotionally numb. They became emotionally efficient. They learned which emotions deserved attention and which ones drained energy. They learned that not every feeling needs to be shared to be real, that not every pain needs an audience to be valid. So while others rely on constant feedback to confirm their reality, solitude-oriented people develop internal confirmation. They don't ask, "Does this make sense to you?" They ask, "Does this make sense to me?" That shift changes everything. Because once validation becomes internal, external approval loses power. Compliments feel nice but unnecessary. Rejection feels disappointing but not devastating. Silence from others doesn't automatically mean something is wrong. And this is where misunderstanding begins. From the outside, they look detached. From the inside, they are regulated. Their emotional baseline is not excitement, it's equilibrium. They don't chase highs, they avoid chaos. That's why they often withdraw before situations become emotionally messy. They sense imbalance early. They notice subtle disrespect, emotional inconsistency, unspoken tension. They don't confront immediately because confrontation requires emotional labor. And they already learned that emotional labor isn't always rewarded. So instead, they step back. This stepping back is often mistaken as avoidance. But psychologically, it's assessment. They ask themselves questions most people avoid. Is this connection reciprocal? Is this draining more than it gives? Am I being understood or merely tolerated? Do I feel clearer or more confused after interacting with this person? And if the answers keep leaning toward depletion, something shifts internally. They don't explode. They don't demand change. They don't issue ultimatums. They detach. And detachment, once mastered, becomes peaceful. This is why people who like being alone often struggle to explain themselves. Not because they lack insight, but because their insight is internal. Translating it into words feels unnecessary, sometimes even unsafe. They learn that explanations don't always bring understanding. Sometimes they bring arguments. Sometimes they bring defensiveness. Sometimes they bring promises that never last. So instead of explaining, they conserve. Silence becomes their boundary. And over time, solitude stops being a reaction. It becomes a preference, not because people are bad, but because peace is rare in solitude. They don't have to manage other people's emotions. They don't have to soften their words. They don't have to filter their thoughts. They don't have to maintain emotional balance for the room. They can just exist. And existence without performance is addictive. This is also why people who enjoy being alone often appear emotionally strong during situations that break others. Breakups, rejection, disappointment, sudden change. It's not that they don't feel loss. It's that they don't lose themselves in it. They already know how to sit with discomfort. They already know how to process internally. They already know how to rebuild emotional structure without external scaffolding. So while others scramble for distraction, they go inward. And inward is where they've always lived. But here's the darker layer most people never see. This self-sufficiency wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival. Because at some point, relying on others felt riskier than relying on oneself. Depending emotionally became unpredictable. Being alone became stable. And once the brain labels something as stable, it prefers it. not because it's lonely, but because it's safe. And that safety rewires desire. They don't crave constant connection. They crave meaningful connection. They don't want many people. They want aligned people. And until that alignment exists, solitude isn't a punishment, it's a sanctuary. But this comes with a cost, because the more someone gets used to solitude, the harder it becomes to tolerate shallow connection. Small talk feels draining. Forced interaction feels invasive. Emotional inconsistency becomes unbearable. And that's where society starts labeling them cold, distant, closed off. But what society is really seeing is someone who stopped leaking energy. Someone who learned, slowly and painfully, that peace is worth protecting. And once solitude stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like alignment, there's no going back. And this leads to the most misunderstood behavior of all: why they can walk away without looking back. Here's the part most people never admit out loud. People who like being alone don't feel powerful because they're isolated. They feel powerful because isolation removed leverage. Leverage that other people unknowingly had over them. Think about it. Most humans live emotionally tethered. Their mood depends on messages being returned. Their confidence depends on being chosen. Their sense of worth depends on being included. When those things disappear, they panic. But for people who learn to stand alone early, something different happens. When someone leaves, nothing collapses. When attention fades, nothing breaks. When silence appears, nothing screams inside them. Because their identity is not externally anchored. Psychology calls this emotional autonomy. But autonomy doesn't feel clinical from the inside. It feels like stillness. And stillness is threatening to a world addicted to noise. This is why people who enjoy being alone often intimidate others without trying. They don't react the way they're expected to. They don't chase reassurance. They don't explain themselves endlessly. They don't beg to be understood. They don't negotiate their worth. And that unsettles people, because most social dynamics rely on emotional dependency. Someone needs approval. Someone needs validation. Someone needs closeness more than the other person. But when one person doesn't need anything, the balance breaks. That's why people who like being alone are often called hard to read. Not because they're mysterious, but because they're not leaking information. They don't wear their emotions on the surface. They don't announce their insecurities. They don't perform vulnerability on demand. They reveal selectively, and selectivity is power. This is also why they don't rush into relationships. Romantic, platonic, professional. They observe first. They watch patterns, not promises. They trust consistency over words. They know that intensity is cheap. Stability is rare. So while others are seduced by attention, they're paying attention to behavior. And this creates another misunderstanding. People think they're distant because they don't open up quickly. But what's really happening is evaluation. They're asking themselves one quiet question: is this safe for my nervous system? If the answer is unclear, they remain alone. And alone feels better than uncertain. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People who like being alone don't fear abandonment the way others do. Not because they never cared, but because they already processed abandonment internally long before it happened externally. They don't cling when distance appears. They adjust. And adjustment looks like coldness to people who depend on emotional reassurance to feel stable. But inside, it's not cold, it's composed. This is why breakups, endings, and cutoffs often look sudden when they involve someone who prefers solitude. From the outside, it looks like they flipped a switch. From the inside, the switch was turned months ago. They don't leave when the pain peaks, they leave when clarity arrives. And clarity is quiet. By the time they walk away, they've already accepted the loss. They've already mourned the potential. They've already imagined life without that person. So when separation finally happens, it doesn't feel like grief. It feels like alignment. And that's what people can't understand, because grief is expected, regret is expected, longing is expected. But peace confuses people, especially those who still need others to regulate their emotions. This is also why people who enjoy being alone rarely go back once they leave. Not because they lack forgiveness, but because returning would mean destabilizing a system they worked hard to build. Their internal order. They don't want to reintroduce emotional chaos just to prove they're capable of connection. They already know they are. They just don't need it to survive. And this independence doesn't make them antisocial. It makes them intentional. They choose connection. They don't chase it. They allow closeness. They don't force it. They give loyalty. They don't beg for reciprocity. And this flips the entire social script. Because when someone is complete on their own, they don't need to compromise themselves to belong. They don't tolerate disrespect for companionship. They don't accept inconsistency for attention. They don't stay where their presence is optional. And once someone reaches this stage psychologically, something irreversible happens. They stop romanticizing connection. They stop fantasizing about being understood by everyone. They stop explaining themselves to people who don't listen. They realize something simple and brutal. Being alone is not the absence of love, it's the absence of distortion. In solitude, there's no pretending, no shrinking, no negotiating identity, just alignment. And alignment is addictive. This is why people who like being alone don't feel like they're missing out. They don't envy constant social lives. They don't feel behind. They don't feel incomplete. They feel finished. Finished chasing, finished performing. And that scares people who are still running. Because when someone stops running, the noise becomes obvious, and silence becomes loud. There's a reason people who prefer solitude often feel like they can see through others. It's not intuition. It's not mysticism. It's exposure. When you spend enough time alone, without distraction, without noise, without constant validation, you start noticing patterns most people are too busy to see. You notice how people change when they want something. You notice how kindness disappears when it's no longer rewarded. You notice how confidence collapses when approval is removed. Solitude sharpens perception. Most people never sit long enough with themselves to recognize their own contradictions. They move from interaction to interaction, from opinion to opinion, absorbing identity from the outside. But people who like being alone don't have that luxury. Silence forces confrontation with fear, with insecurity, with ego, with unresolved questions. And once you've faced your own shadow, other people's masks become obvious. This is why people who enjoy solitude often feel disconnected in group settings. Not because they hate people, but because they can sense the performance. They hear what's being said and what's being avoided. They notice who dominates conversations and who disappears. They feel the tension behind jokes. They see how quickly values shift depending on the room. And once you see this, it's hard to unsee. Psychologically, solitude increases metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, to step back and observe behavior instead of being swallowed by it. This makes people who like being alone less reactive. They don't jump into arguments. They don't rush to defend themselves. They don't mirror emotional chaos. They pause. And pause is threatening, because most people rely on emotional immediacy to feel connected. They expect instant reactions, instant reassurance, instant engagement. But the solitary mind doesn't rush. It evaluates. This creates another misunderstanding. People think they're emotionally unavailable, but the truth is, they're emotionally precise. They don't express everything. They express what matters. They don't talk to fill space. They talk to convey meaning. And in a world addicted to noise, meaning feels heavy. This is also why people who like being alone often struggle with shallow relationships. Small talk drains them. Repetitive conversations exhaust them. Social rituals without substance feel pointless. They don't want many connections. They want real ones. And real connections require depth. Depth requires honesty. Honesty requires discomfort. So instead of forcing connection, they retreat, not because they can't connect, but because they refuse to dilute themselves. Here's something most people never realize. People who enjoy being alone are often deeply empathetic. But their empathy doesn't show up as constant caretaking. It shows up as restraint. They don't rush to fix others. They don't impose advice. They don't emotionally intrude. They respect internal space because they value their own, and this makes them appear distant to people who confuse closeness with access. But access is earned, and this brings us to a critical point. People who like being alone don't fear intimacy. They fear distortion. They fear losing clarity. They fear emotional chaos. They fear environments that demand they become someone else. So they choose solitude as a baseline. From that baseline, they allow others in slowly. This is why when they do connect, it's intense. Not dramatic, not volatile, but solid. They listen deeply, they remember details, they show up consistently, but they don't overextend. And once trust breaks, something changes permanently. They don't fight to repair what already showed them its limit. They don't demand apologies. They don't seek closure conversations. They don't chase accountability. They simply step back. Because once someone has shown you who they are consistently, believing them is not bitterness, it's intelligence. This is also why people who like being alone often feel older than their age. Not because they lack joy, but because they've processed things early. They've already accepted impermanence. They've already detached from fantasy. They've already grieved illusions. While others are still chasing experiences to define themselves, the solitary mind has already integrated identity internally. And this creates a strange paradox. They feel deeply. But they don't dramatize, they care strongly. But they don't cling, they love fully. But they don't lose themselves. And that balance is rare, so rare that society often mislabels it. Calls it coldness, calls it arrogance, calls it emotional distance. But what it really is emotional maturity without exhibition. People who like being alone don't need to prove depth. They live it quietly. They don't need an audience to feel real. They don't need affirmation to feel grounded. They don't need constant interaction to feel alive. Their inner world is already active. And once someone has built a world inside themselves, the external world loses its authority. They don't reject society. They just don't depend on it. And that independence changes everything. There's something most people don't realize about liking being alone. It's not just a preference. It's a nervous system state. People who enjoy solitude aren't constantly seeking stimulation because their nervous system doesn't need chaos to feel alive. In fact, too much stimulation overwhelms them, crowds drain them, noise exhausts them, emotional unpredictability unsettles them. And psychology explains why. When someone spends a lot of time alone, especially by choice, their nervous system adapts. It learns how to self-regulate without external input. It learns how to calm itself without reassurance. It learns how to return to baseline without distraction. This is rare. Most people outsource regulation. They regulate through other people's reactions, through attention, through validation, through constant engagement. That's why silence feels unbearable to them. But for people who like being alone, silence is not absence. Silence is homeostasis. In silence, their breathing slows. Their thoughts organize. Their body releases tension. They don't need to escape their mind because they've already learned how to live inside it. This creates a fundamental difference in how they experience the world. They don't chase highs. They don't fear lows. They exist in range, and range equals resilience. This is also why they often appear calm during situations that overwhelm others. While someone else is spiraling, they're observing. While someone else is reacting, they're grounding, not because they don't care, but because their system isn't hijacked. Solitude trained them. But here's the part people misunderstand. This regulation didn't come easily. For many people who like being alone, solitude started as protection, not pleasure. It was a refuge from overstimulation, misunderstanding, or emotional volatility. They withdrew not to isolate it, but to stabilize. And over time, that withdrawal became mastery. They learned how to process emotions internally, how to sit with discomfort without fleeing, how to let feelings pass without dramatizing them. They didn't suppress emotion, they integrated it. This is why they don't panic when relationships end, why they don't collapse when routines break, why they don't cling when people pull away. They've already practiced internal containment, and containment creates freedom. This is also why they value routine, familiar environments, predictable rhythms. Not because they're boring, but because predictability allows depth. When the external world is stable, the internal world can expand. That's where creativity grows. That's where insight forms. That's where meaning develops. People who enjoy being alone often have rich inner narratives. They think deeply. They reflect often. They connect dots others miss. Because when the mind isn't constantly reacting, it can observe. This is also why they're sensitive to emotional dishonesty. They can feel when something is off, when words don't match energy, when someone is pretending. Their nervous system picks it up before logic does. And once that awareness exists, they can't go back to ignorance. They can't tolerate chaotic dynamics just to feel included. They can't ignore red flags to avoid being alone. They can't unfeel misalignment, so they choose solitude instead of self-betrayal. This choice rewires priorities. They stop asking, how do I fit in? They start asking, does this align? They stop fearing exclusion. They start valuing coherence. And coherence feels better than belonging. This is why people who like being alone often live quieter lives, but heavier ones. Their decisions carry weight. Their words carry intention. Their presence carries grounding. They don't scatter themselves. They conserve. And conservation builds strength. So when people accuse them of being detached, what they're really noticing is regulation. When people say they're distant, what they're really encountering is containment. And when people say, you don't need anyone, what they're actually seeing is self-sufficiency, not emotional numbness, not arrogance, but an internal system that knows how to hold itself. And once someone reaches that level of internal stability, something changes forever. They stop fearing solitude. They stop romanticizing chaos. They stop mistaking intensity for connection. They understand that peace is not boring. Peace is earned. Here's the final truth most people never understand. People who like being alone are not running away from life. They are running away from distortion. Distortion of identity, distortion of values, distortion of self. They are not afraid of people. They are afraid of losing themselves inside environments that demand performance instead of presence. Most humans are taught early to trade authenticity for acceptance. Smile when you don't feel it. Agree when you don't believe it. Stay quiet when speaking would cost connection. People who like being alone reached a breaking point with that trade. At some moment, consciously or not, they decided something quietly radical. I would rather be alone than be false. And that decision rewires everything. They stop chasing belonging at the cost of integrity. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop shrinking to fit rooms that never expanded to hold them. They don't reject society. They reject the version of society that demands self-abandonment. This is why solitude feels like relief to them, not relief from people. Relief from pretending. When they're alone, there's no role to maintain, no emotional labor to perform, no identity to defend. They can think clearly. They can feel honestly. They can exist without negotiation. And that clarity becomes addictive. This is also why they don't fear time the way others do. Silence doesn't scare them. Empty evenings don't haunt them. Stillness doesn't threaten them, because they've learned something early. The relationship you have with yourself is the longest one you'll ever live. And they invested in it. While others outsourced meaning to careers, relationships, social circles, or external milestones, the solitary mind turned inward and asked harder questions. Who am I without applause? What do I believe when no one is watching? What actually matters when distractions fall away? And answering those questions changes you. It makes you harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to shame, harder to pressure. This is why people who like being alone often feel untouchable, not invincible, but unmovable. They don't break easily because they're not split internally. They don't live in contradiction. They live in alignment. And alignment doesn't need witnesses. This doesn't mean they never connect. It means when they do, it's real. When they choose someone, it's intentional. When they commit, it's grounded. When they love, it's steady. But they never confuse attachment with meaning. They know that loneliness is not being alone. Loneliness is being unseen. And solitude, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's clarity. So if you are someone who likes being alone and the world keeps trying to tell you that something is wrong with you, understand this. You are not antisocial. You are not broken. You are not emotionally unavailable. You are internally anchored. You learned how to hold yourself when others couldn't. You learned how to think when others distracted themselves. You learned how to be whole without borrowing identity. And that makes you rare. In a world addicted to noise, you chose silence. In a world addicted to validation, you chose truth. In a world addicted to connection at any cost, you chose integrity. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you awake. And once someone wakes up to themselves, they don't go back to sleep just to fit in. They move slower. They speak less. They choose carefully. But when they move from truth. And truth doesn't rush. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists. And so do you.